Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our April Health Equity Speaker Series event. We're so glad to have you here with us today. We'll give everyone a few minutes to join. In the meantime, please feel free to drop something in the where you are located today in the chat and something you hope to gain from today's session. We try to make every GlowMed space as accessible as possible. And to do this, we'll read any visual content aloud and we'll do our best to uplift and read any thoughts that come through the chat. And we'll give you a warning if we start any music, so that way you can turn your volume down if you choose. Also, we have a live transcript available in English, which you can access through the toolbar at the bottom. And feel free to participate with the video on and off today and use the chat and reactions as you see fit. If you need any technical support, please reach out to India Benson, who is acting as our tech personnel today. And you can find her name in the participants list with the word tech next to it. And we'll get started in about 4 or so minutes. Thanks, everyone. All right, everyone. Thank you again for joining us today. Today is our latest installment of the Health Equity Speaker Series. These monthly events are where we turn to the experts in the global health equity movement, particularly the leaders who are Black, Indigenous, people of color, and from marginalized communities, as their expertise and contributions are most often systemically overlooked. As an organization, GLOMED aims to mobilize a community of students and grassroots leaders to improve the health of people around the world. GLOMED students learn about health equity leadership directly from the experts, from our grassroots partners in Asia, Africa, and the Americas, and become a part of the movement for global health equity. We also believe in the power of the community behind this movement, which is why we make these programs available to everyone. Additionally, these programs are possible because of the generous support of our community, and we'll drop a donation link in the chat for you to invest in this program. Again, my name is Jonathan Casnetta. I use the pronouns he, him, and I serve as GLOMED program coordinator. I'm also an alumni of the GLOMED at UT Austin chapter, and I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker today, Olivia Gonzalez. Olivia Gonzalez is a full-time trauma nurse in the Milwaukee's Trauma Level 1 Hospital, and a Master's of Public Health candidate from the University of Wisconsin-Madison School of Medicine and Public Health. As a new graduate nurse, Olivia found herself repeatedly caring for gunshot wound victims, a completely preventable injury. With her interest in public health, she reached out to explore what Milwaukee was doing to mitigate the morbidity and mortality of gun violence. She knew she wanted to support the public health approach to gun violence prevention and found herself working with an organization called 414 Life, a Milwaukee organization she'll soon tell us all about in her presentation. Let's welcome Olivia to and she will introduce us to rethinking gun violence through a public health lens. But before we begin, I want to remind everyone that if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat, DM India or myself, or wait until the end and we'll have some time for audience Q&A. I'll now pass it over to Olivia.
Thank you, Jonathan. I appreciate the warm welcome. It is a privilege and an honor to be speaking for GLOMED today. I'm going to go ahead and set up my screen share here. Let's do this portion of screen. All right, bear with me here. All right, great. I'm glad we can all see that. Beautiful. All right, so just like Jonathan said, today I'll be talking to you all about gun violence prevention and awareness and rethinking gun violence as a public health issue. Let's go ahead and clear that so we can see better. So let's see, make sure that's working. There we go. So before I start today's conversation, I just wanted to preface that today's conversation is heavy. It is emotionally and mentally taxing. So if at any part in today's conversation, you feel triggered, you feel overwhelmed, it's just too much to handle right now. Totally understandable. That is the nature of gun violence. Feel free to excuse yourself from the room and revisit this later if you so choose. I did want to also mention that I'm battling a little bit of a cold right now with congestion. So if you have difficulty understanding me, hearing me, let me know in the chat. So before we go into it, I just want to tell you a little bit about me. So I was born and raised in the Milwaukee suburbs. I went to school at UW-Madison and graduated with my bachelor's of nursing in science in 2020, the beginning of the pandemic. I accepted a full-time position as a trauma nurse at Froedtert and the Medical College of Wisconsin, which is the Trauma Level 1 hospital in Milwaukee. At the same time, I accepted my position at UW School of Medicine and Public Health in the Master's of Public Health program. With that being said, I walked into the trauma unit as a bright-eyed and bushy-tailed trauma nurse. I didn't really know what to expect. My first day on the unit, I had received my report on my upcoming patients, and we walked into my first patient's room. He was a young Black man about my age who had suffered 4 gunshot wounds to the abdomen. I was instructed to assess for nerve damage and pain control and then change his wound dressing. But all I could think about at the time was how and why this happened and how preventable this injury probably was. I didn't really think that I would see this injury that often, but I came back to work the next day and saw it again. Same thing, young Black male. And it was really frustrating for me. I kept caring for young gunshot wound patients, a disproportionate majority of them being young Black men. So I knew that there was more I could be doing, and I reached out to my community. And that's kind of how I got involved with gun violence prevention. Before I move any further in today's conversation, I did want to mention 2 things. I opted to join into this conversation about gun violence and gun violence prevention, whereas others who don't have that privilege, they have some socioeconomic barriers, non-modifiable identities, race, gender, they don't get that privilege. So I want to recognize that I'm speaking on behalf of someone who doesn't know this lived experience firsthand, and a young Hispanic female that benefited off of white privilege and has the opportunity to amplify the need for advocacy rather than speak and understand the experience myself. So I want to talk about what we're going to go through today, gun violence at large. We'll start with an introduction to gun violence. We'll then transition into the context of where gun violence happens, not only in Milwaukee at the national level, but also at the international level. We're then going to transition into reframing gun violence. How do we approach gun violence like a disease? And then I'll talk about some of my work in Milwaukee's response to gun violence. And then I want to leave you with, what is your role in prevention? How do you stop gun violence? So we're going to start with the statistic. Over 41,000 American lives were lost to gun violence in 2021. In 2020, we saw the highest rate of gun violence ever seen in America. And then 2021 happened and it surpassed it. This was a 30% increase from 2019. Before we move any further in today's conversation, let's talk about what gun violence actually is. Gun violence includes violent crimes, including homicides, school shootings, and mass shootings, non-fatal shootings that result in injury and non-life-threatening injury, legal intervention, including police force, and attempted and successful suicide. Basically, if it involves a gun unsafely, it is considered gun violence. However, I want to make the distinction here that this is different than terrorism, armed conflict, and war. A lot of databases will make sure that they delineate of which one is which. So let's talk about some statistics. Is this really that big of an issue? In Texas today, there's going to be one death every 2 hours from gun violence. In America alone, women are 21 times more likely to die of gun violence than their counterparts in any other high-income country, especially in Europe. And then lastly, affecting children. This is one of the leading causes of death in American children under 18. It's more than motor vehicle crashes, that used to be the highest rate of gun violence. Excuse me, the highest rate of morbidity and mortality in American children. So let's talk about the context. Who is really affected? So all Americans are at risk for gun violence. As we understand, it can happen anywhere. However, statistics repeatedly show that men are 6 times more likely to die of gun violence than women. Young adults at that ages 15 to 34 especially. And then Black Americans are the highest rates of firearm-related deaths among all races and ethnicities. I want to emphasize this point, this inequity, this disparity in mortality and morbidity among this demographic. Young Black men ages 15 to 34 only account for 2% of the US population. But in 2019, they accounted for 37% of all firearm-related homicides. That's 1 out of every 3 homicides was a young Black man. So where? At the national level, this is happening in metropolitan cities, as you can expect. There is a disproportionate number of gun violence related homicides and non-fatal shootings happening in the South and Southeastern United States. Historically, gun violence is higher in these areas because that's where gun regulation, gun culture, and rights are historically more protected. Also, I want to talk about in metropolitan cities, criminologists draw the association that there's a disproportionate number of ethnic and racial minorities in metropolitan cities opposed to suburban and rural America. At the international level, however, gun violence isn't uniquely an American issue. In fact, it occurs in low and middle income countries at higher rates than it ever does in high income countries. In fact, the United States is an exception to those rates. In fact, 1 in 20 deaths in Central and Latin America are actually from homicides related to firearms. That's over 5% of the region's mortality is related to gun violence, a completely preventable issue. So when? Gun violence really caught American national attention with a rise in gang violence in the 1980s. However, with some of my work with gun control, gun violence, and 414 Life, which is an organization I'll mention to you later, I can mention that gun violence related to gang involvement isn't as large as it once was. Really, we saw a peak of gang involvement in the 1980s and 1990s that's since dissipated. However, we saw a lot of firearm fatalities soar in 2014, likely attributing to gun sale growth. That's not to discredit that there aren't still gangs involved. There still is a lot of gang involvement. A lot of cities are seeing cliques as well, which aren't considered a gang, but more so a group of people different than a gang. So in 2020, we saw the most violent year of gun violence we've ever seen before. We saw a significant jump in firearm-related injuries and death. Think about COVID-19. COVID-19 exacerbated the gun violence problem for a plethora of reasons. Think about compounded stress, the financial strain, the emotional strain on relationships, the inability to communicate appropriately and cope appropriately to the changing environments. And think about how this disproportionately affected urban America and minorities at that. Similarly, think of the summer 2020. What was happening in the United States at the time? We had a lot of civil unrest. Think about the Black Lives Matter movement, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd. This disproportionately was affecting minorities in metropolitan USA as well. And then again, with the COVID-19 pandemic, gun sales also increased in 2020. So we kind of talked about it with context of what are some of the risk factors that increase an individual's likelihood to experience gun violence. I want you to reflect on your own identities here as we approach this conversation. If you yourself haven't been a witness, a victim, or you don't know anyone who's experienced gun violence, think about why that might be. What in your lived experience, your environment, your non-modifiable identities protected you or put you at risk for gun violence? So at an individual level, some risk factors that the literature repeatedly show is that access to a firearm or having an unlocked firearm in the house is the #1 risk factor for initial gun violence. Likewise, poor educational attainment, history of drug and alcohol use, history of mental illness, all contribute to putting an individual more at risk for gun violence, either being a victim or a perpetrator of gun violence. The previous exposures to gun violence is also a #1 risk factor for recurrent gun violence. Basically, if you experience gun violence once before, you're at a higher likelihood of experiencing it again. At the community level, we've talked about under-resourced neighborhoods. Do resources have food security? Are there food deserts? Are there resources that people are able to get? What about the poverty rates? A lot of times maps of poverty-stricken areas will directly shadow and mirror where gun violence is occurring. In Milwaukee, I can simply attest to the segregation and lack of community connectedness happening with the white flight in the 1950s and 60s that make minorities disproportionately in urban city areas, which also contributes to a risk factor for gun violence. Adversely, what are some protective factors? What decreases an individual's likelihood to experience gun violence? Think about your own identities here, like I mentioned, if you haven't experienced gun violence yourself. Do you have a positive self-esteem? Does your network have a positive self-esteem? How you view yourself greatly affects and protects you against gun violence. Do you have healthy communication styles? Are you getting in an argument with your roommates and pulling out a gun? Or are you able to communicate effectively? What about your family relationships, your social networks? Are they engaging in gun violence? Are you connecting with them? And then your educational attainments. Gun violence is not as common in secondary and university level education. Why might that be? At the community level, we have access to community resources that mitigate us from gun violence. If you have a strong sense of community connectedness, you feel attached to your community. And your social capital, your community is providing things as much as you are providing your community. We're now going to transition into rethinking gun violence. What does gun violence look like as an infectious disease? We're going to study, so we just study diseases in health all the time. COVID-19, common cold, malaria. How do we use that framework and apply it and approach it to gun violence? So here we've got the epidemiological triad. We talk about this framework in epidemiology all the time. It uses the host, the agent, and the environment to study a disease. Let's take the common cold. Unfortunately, with something I've got going on right now. So it's very new to me, very easy to me. So the host, who is at risk for developing the common cold? Well, think about children. Children are always gross and in, stuff and touching things, putting things in their mouth. They're at risk for developing a common cold. Immunocompromised folk, those populations don't have the immune system to fight off the common cold, so they're more likely to experience a cold. People who are around sick people, they are just increased frequency to develop a cold. The agent, so what's actually causing the common cold? Well, viruses like influenza, rhinovirus, those sorts of things are causing a common cold. And the environment. Where is a common cold happening? Well, think about the host. Densely populated areas, schools, hospitals where immunocompromised people might be, that sort of things. So we know disease transmission spreads from person to person, right? Taking a peek on the left, one person is affected, they spread it to their networks, and then their networks continue spreading it, all with that epidemiological triad in mind. But we have interventions to break that cycle, that break that transmission. How do we stop the spread? Well, COVID-19 showed us a lot, right? Use of masks, use of staying home, medications, sleeping, seeking medical attention, maybe when you're feeling sick or ill, not going out into the community to prevent that disease transmission. By using these proactive approaches, we stop the spread and the transmission of disease, right? So how do we use that framework and apply it to gun violence? How do we look at gun violence as a disease? Well, let's look at the host again. The who is this happening to? We said all Americans, right? There's mass shootings that happen at malls. There are school shootings. Any American can be a victim of gun violence. But we also talked about how this disproportionately affects young Black men. So that's the host, that's the who this is happening to. The agent, the what? Well, firearms, bullets, people, guns. Guns are the reason gun violence is a disease. But that allows us to think about what allows us to have access to firearms. And then lastly, the environment. Where is this taking place? Well, we talked about that in the beginning of this lecture today, that this is disproportionately happening in disenfranchised neighborhoods. Likewise, the current socio-political climate is maintaining this disease in the community. But no exception, we talked about how gun violence can be happening in school settings, in random places, or premeditated places as well. But just like the common cold, there are so many ways we can stop transmission. So like the common cold, we talked about a risk factor of gun violence. One act of gun violence is a risk factor for another act of gun violence, that remediation or retaliation. How do we break that violent behavior and break the cycle of violence? Well, employing a multidisciplinary effort to detect and interrupt violence among those most at risk to change community norms has been proven effective. So we take someone who has been a victim of violence or maybe a perpetrator of gun violence. How do we get them the community resources they need to not repeat violence again or not be retaliate? How do we get them mental health services, How do we make sure that this is in schools to prevent young generations from thinking that violence is a norm because they've been hearing it in their community since they've been 3? It's any time they can remember, they can hear a gunshot wound in the distance. How do we make sure hospitals and trauma centers are on board with this public health approach to preventing gun violence? Fortunately, lo and behold, this framework has been coined as the Cure Violence model. This model takes a public health approach, multidisciplinary action to preventing gun violence internationally. It first came about actually in the early 2000s by an infectious disease doctor out of Chicago who noticed his city in Chicago was being stricken with gun violence repeatedly. Impoverished neighborhoods in Chicago were reaching gun violence rates that they had never seen before. So he looked at gun violence like the model we just expressed, that infectious disease model, where he starts with 3 major steps. 1, we detect and interrupt the transmission of violence. Where do we anticipate violence will occur? And how do we intervene before it erupts? Think about those neighborhoods, those targeted neighborhoods, those at-risk neighborhoods where we talked about gun violence most often occurs, poverty, disenfranchised neighborhoods. Those are our target neighborhoods that we have to support. We're transitioning into step number 2. How do we change the behavior of those at highest risk? How do we identify those at highest risk for violence and then work to change their behavior? We talked about those who are at risk for gun violence. They themselves have been a victim or a previous perpetrator of gun violence. So how do we work to get them the resources they need to change their behavior and change the norm? And then 3, how do we promote changing the norms in the community? We talked about a protective factor is experiencing social capital or connectedness to your community. How do we advocate for that and amplify changing the community norms to make social capital and feel like your community is providing you something just as much as you're providing your community? So Cure Violence is this framework that, like I mentioned, it started in Chicago, had fantastic results within 3 months of them developing it. In fact, in the 3-month span that they developed this, or they implemented the Cure Violence framework in the West Garfield community in Chicago, they saw shootings, non-fatal and fatal shootings drop by 67% in 3 months. That's astounding. So they replicated this. They went internationally. They put it in places all across the United States. It's popping up in areas like Baltimore, Chicago, Orange County, New York, the Bronx specifically. In Central and Latin America, where there's a disproportionate number of gun violence compared to the rest of the world, they've seen Honduras, they've seen Trinidad, Puerto Rico experience decreases in firearm-related fatalities and non-fatal injuries. So at the international level too, the Cure Violence model works to combat SDGs all across the spectrum there. But most notably, it affects the SDG number 3, good health and well-being, by decreasing morbidity and mortality from firearm-related injuries. It also works to combat SDG number 11, sustainable cities and communities. It's promoting that social capital and feeling connected to your community. And 3, it's promoting SDG number 16, peace, justice, and strong institutions, by decreasing the number of non-fatal and fatal shootings in the area. So now we're going to transition into Milwaukee, my own community. What has our response been to gun violence, and how have we taken this Cure Violence approach and made it kind of our own? So I want to start with some statistics. Like I've experienced in my first couple days, and honestly still today as a trauma nurse, Milwaukee gun violence is paralleling national trends. We look at the age, gender, and race of Milwaukee gunshot wound victims and perpetrators. They are still young Black men, disproportionately ages 15 to 34. Even further, we see that 2021 was the worst year of gun violence in Milwaukee. Unfortunately, we thought 2020 was going to be the worst, and then 2021 happens. I checked as of this morning. Unfortunately, Milwaukee has surpassed the number of gunshot related fatalities by 27 individuals as of this morning. So if that trend continues, we unfortunately are on track to have 2022 be the worst year of gun violence our city has ever experienced. So we adopted a cure violence approach to preventing gun violence in 2017 called 414 Life. So I want to introduce you to 414 Life, which is the cure violence method and approach to preventing gun violence in Milwaukee. So because of funding resources, Milwaukee unfortunately doesn't call itself cure violence. It's its own separate entity, but follows a framework very similar to the cure violence framework, where we are working to prevent, interrupt, and then change the norms. So I want to introduce you to the picture on the screen is our violence interrupter team. This is our team working on the ground in Milwaukee neighborhoods who are interrupting violence, de-escalating situations that may turn futile or turn into a gun violence altercation. These folks are incredible. They are from the Milwaukee area themselves, as all violence interrupters are targeted to their communities. So we hope that all violence interrupters who are working in their communities are from those communities, so they understand the social norms that are taking and the gun culture that is taking place in that community in which they're from. So this group of folk, if I could give a Nobel Peace Prize to them, I simply would. They are phenomenal. Some of them may have caught a case of in a federal prison, in a local prison for gun trafficking, for gun violence. In fact, one of our gun violence interrupters, or some of them may have had gang involvement in the past. They themselves have been in the hospital for 6 months at a time because of a gun violence related injury. They themselves may have been a perpetrator of gun violence. They have lost a family member to gun violence. In some way, they are personally affected by gun violence. What unifies this team, however, and makes them uniquely appropriate to be doing the work in Milwaukee is that they all are resilient and they have this underlying goal to change the community that they unfortunately hurt at one time and to improve it by de-escalation, by canvassing, by engaging their community with 414 Life. So this is the violence interrupter team. This is the team that works on hands on the ground, or boots on the ground, I should say. So then we have our community coordinators. These are the people who take that multidisciplinary approach, get local NGOs who are also working on violence prevention. Maybe they have mental health resources for some of our violence victims. The community coordinators are really the ones making sure those interdisciplinary relationships are being formed and are being used by people who have experienced trauma. And then we also have our hospital responder, the individual who works with local hospitals and our trauma centers, specifically at Freighter, where I work, to work with gun violence victims in the hospital. So at a very broad lens, gun violence prevention organizations like 414 Life, like Cure Violence chapters across the world, get a little bit difficult to understand because we do so much. We have so many resources, and it's kind of challenging to understand, like, okay, so what do we actually do? What does your work actually look like? So let's dive into that. So this is 414 Life in action. I want to start with in the middle. 414 Life, this is our violence interrupter team. Imagine they're in the middle. We take an interdisciplinary approach to promoting violence prevention in Milwaukee. Take a peek at your left, the primary funding resources. The City of Milwaukee and the City of Milwaukee Health Department is a large source of funding for 414 Life, the Office of Violence Prevention especially, as well as Freighter and the Medical College of Wisconsin. That's our primary hospital response body that receives the majority of gunshot wound victims in the city. So they're primarily funding 414 Life to operate. Moving to the right there, we see 414 Life works with the MPS curriculum and MPS schools, Milwaukee Public Schools, that is, to target at-risk youth who are at risk of committing gun violence, whether their peers or their teachers recognize that maybe there are some behavioral risks that 414 Life should approach to prevent a young Black male, or a young individual, I should say, from committing a act of violence. 414 Life also takes community engagement events. Over the summer, we're having what we call community pop-ups, where we are getting our name out there, making sure people understand that 414 Life is a resource for them, and will get them the resources they need, whether they are experiencing gun violence themselves, they know someone who's experienced gun violence and needs support, and really just to get the name out there and connect the community as a whole to really promote that social capital. If you've heard of needle exchange programs, 414 Life takes a very similar approach, where we give free gun locks to any and all individuals who ask for them. Unfortunately, whether it's a 12-year-old asking for a gun lock, or whether it's a 72-year-old asking for a gun lock, we provide them to the community free of charge and free of question. 414 Life violence interrupters also work to mediate violence and conflict at any and all times of the day. This is a incredibly risky job, as they are called to scenes where tensions are high, emotions are even higher, and there may be a loaded firearm in the facility or in the area. So our violence interrupters are highly trained in de-escalation. It is so important in de-escalation and violence mitigation that those who are de-escalating and intervening to prevent retaliation look like you and have a lived experience like you. It'd be very, very different experience if I myself, who's never experienced gun violence, doesn't have firsthand knowledge of being in a gun violence altercation, to go in and tell others to stop what they're doing and change their behaviors. It means a lot different when someone who knows that experience and who has felt those feelings before is providing advice. And then 414 Life also provides local resources, referrals, mental health services to patients inside the hospital who are experiencing gun violence healing, or outside if they have non-fatal injuries or a victim of trauma. 414 Life also works with Fredericton and the Medical College of Wisconsin and Ascension, which is a healthcare system in the local Milwaukee area, to treat and respond to gunshot victims. I want to dive into what that looks like. What does the hospital setting look like in 414 Life? So in the hospital setting, this is one of the most important components of gun violence prevention that we can take, and it requires that hospital-based violence intervention program that we're seeing pop up all across the country, all across the world, actually, which is really cool. So healthcare systems are recognizing they play a fundamental role in preventing gun violence retaliation, and it all starts at a hospital. So let's start on the far left, where a gun altercation will occur in the community, resulting in injury. That gunshot wound victim will be transported to the local hospital, in which an emergency department social worker will page the 414 Life hospital responder. 9 times out of 10, the patient is unconscious and unwilling to consent to get 414 Life involved. In fact, I think this rarely happens because gun violence victims, they're being treated for their injuries. They're in immense pain. The last thing they want to have a conversation about is hey, do you want to get social work involved? That conversation rarely takes place. But that 414 Life responder will get the page that a victim of gun violence has arrived to the hospital. Most times, family members will come to the hospital as well in an emotional mess. This is pivotal to make sure that the 414 Life team is responsive and there at the hospital to de-escalate and provide emotional support for the family, for the family's network, and for the victim's network to prevent a retaliation. If you could imagine, those tensions are high for the family. They don't know what the outcome is going to be for their loved one who was just admitted to the hospital. Maybe they're in emergency treatment, etc. So the 414 Life hospital responder establishes a relationship with the victim's family, their friends, their social networks, and makes sure that no one is at risk of retaliating the individual or the individuals who maybe shot the victim. So establishing that connection is so fundamental to prevent another altercation from happening in the community that day, that week, or later in the future, or even when the patient discharges from the hospital. So in the far upper right corner, you see the patient is recovering in the hospital. They may be working with trauma psychologists to work through the emotionally stressful and mentally taxing components of the gunshot wound altercation that's probably replaying in the patient's head, as well as obviously healing from the injury itself. So the patient will eventually heal at the hospital. 414 Life will be providing resources while they're in the hospital setting and when they transition out of the hospital setting, checking up frequently, like, hey, are you thinking about retaliating to offset that risk? The patient then will come back to the hospital about a week up and have a follow-up appointment with their trauma care team, making sure that the 414 Life hospital responder is also there to discuss the mental health of the patient. We have to understand that the patient is going back to a community that hurt them. Not only is that stressful and stress-inducing, they are at risk of developing mental illness as a result of that, or now being another victim of gun violence. And then continually 414 Life will maintain the relationship with not only the patient, but their family as well to provide and support the patient as they continue on living in the community. So I want to turn to, what is your role in gun violence prevention? How do you fit the framework, and how do we take this from understanding to action? The most important thing I can say is get involved. Get involved with your community, whether it's with gun violence prevention organizations, like see if they have a cure violence chapter in your neighborhood. If they are other gun violence prevention organizations, contribute to peace marches that are happening in your neighborhood. Advocate for legislation, for policy, and reform regarding firearm safety. If you're a healthcare practitioner or you're going to be going into the healthcare sector, I want you to remember a trauma-informed care approach. You're promoting safety, respect, and removing bias from the patient's mechanism of injury. You're not judging the patient or asking, I wonder what they did to receive gun violence and be a victim of gun violence. Rather, you're asking, how can I support this patient as I understand that they are now at risk for being another victim of gun violence? And then you're going to advocate for hospital-based violence intervention programs similar to 414 Life, which is popping up. It's still in its infancy, but it is growing beautifully. And it's popping up, like I said, all across the United States and internationally as well. But most importantly, I want you to check your bias. Just because gun violence may not be happening in your community, may not be affecting your immediate social circles or your networks, doesn't mean it isn't a problem, and doesn't mean gun violence prevention isn't our problem. As a young Hispanic female, I recognize that it's my role to amplify and advocate for underrepresented voices that aren't being protected or heard, and I urge you to do the same. These are some of my resources, and I just want to thank you for your time, your attention, and most importantly, your support. Whether it's in gun violence or whatever your avenue of improving the world is, I thank you for a safer and healthier tomorrow with GlobeMed. With that being said, I invite any questions, any comments, any insights at this time.
Hi, Olivia. My name is Brandy. I'm in Knoxville, Tennessee. I'm actually in an MPH program and also have my BSN. I just had a question. Have y'all done any work to collaborate with jails and like the public health system?
Yes, great question, Brandy. Thank you. And I applaud you for being a nurse in public health. I think the overlap of that, as you can even see at the bedside, is so important. In regards to your question about jails, yes and no. Working with government and state and federal organizations with 414 Life gets a little tricky. We provide resources to people who have left the penitentiary system. However, our work in prisons is a little sticky because of our funding resources and the purpose and values of 414 Life. A big thing with the community in which we target is that we don't want to instill fear or a mistrust that them providing de-escalation or them needing 414 Life at a time will put them at risk of being incarcerated if they get somebody involved, right? So though we are working to bridge that relationship with penitentiary systems, it's still in its infancy, and we don't want to discredit the trust that 414 Life has, and that it is separate from a policing body, if that makes sense.
I apologize if you already said this in your presentation. I came in a little bit late, so sorry if you have to repeat yourself, but I'm just curious, like, how you got into this work. So I'm applying to med school this summer, actually, and I'm thinking about, or just trying to discern like what I want to go into within the medical field. And, emergency medicine has been on my mind. I don't know if that's actually the route for me, but did you always know that you wanted to go into trauma nursing, or was this something that, you were inspired to do later in life because something happened, or I don't know?
Good question, Savannah. First of all, congrats on almost applying to med school. That's so exciting. Secondly, so I took a trauma nursing job right out of college. Trauma resonates with my personality. I like fast paced. I like kind of wild things, but I didn't anticipate seeing gun violence at the rate I did. Like I said, I grew up in the Milwaukee suburbs. I knew about gun violence was occurring, but I was very sheltered in the sense that it wasn't happening in my neighborhood. It wasn't affecting me. It's kind of out of sight, out of mind. And that was very sheltered approach. So when I got onto the unit and I was caring for people my age who had sustained gunshot wound victims and who were new paraplegics, new quadriplegics at 22, I was like, whoa, this is a lot. And this is a direct reflection of where resources aren't being allocated in our community. Because how come I had never cared for a young white female victim of gun violence? How come I was never caring for most often, other race than Black and any other ethnicity other than Hispanic? It felt there was a disconnect. So I knew trauma nursing was where my passion was, but it just kind of lifted off the more I saw this disease pattern pop up in my work. So good question. If you're thinking about emergency medicine, I fully support that. We need so many emergency responders who take a public health approach to emergency medicine and recognize that there's really no such thing as an accident, because there should have been interventions prior to that happening, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Olivia, I just want to uplift some things that are coming through the chat. There's a lot of people saying thank you for your presentation, and they're eager to take it back to their different communities. And as Christine mentioned, we will be sending out this PowerPoint resources to them. That way they're able to review it with their communities. And that came in from Elaine, Brandy, and Anne. So everybody's loving your presentation. I just want to say thank you again for coming. And yeah, we can open it back up to questions. I just wanted to uplift those things that were coming through the chat real quick.
Thank you, Jonathan. I really appreciate you mentioning that.
I know one question I had, I know you said that 414 is starting to do some more creating more chapters or things like that. How is that working, and who's are y'all reaching out to certain like regions of the different states and communities, or communities reaching out to y'all to kind of find out y'all's best practices? What is that looking like right now?
Yeah, so 414 Life being a Milwaukee-based organization, they are pretty much they're staying in the Milwaukee area, but these cure violence chapters are popping up all over the United States as they've noticed that the uptick in violence, it really requires this multidisciplinary approach. So we've had folks in Madison reach out to the 414 Life team to better understand, how is our model working? What are some gaps? What are some barriers to, improving the 414 efforts? So that they've been reaching out, which is cool. A lot of organizations turn actually to Chicago, to Baltimore, to some of the way more successful and long-standing cure violence chapters. Charlotte, North Carolina, I can say, is just beginning to take off in their cure violence partnership, where they're taking this multidisciplinary approach to getting violence interrupters, boots on the ground type method, as well as working with all these community resources and hospitals and trauma centers to take this all hands on deck approach.
Awesome, thank you. Are there any other questions? India, Christine, did y'all get any through the chat that maybe they've sent personally? All right, I'm seeing that there's none that they received. If there's no more questions, I just want to say again, thank you so much for coming in, Olivia, and even through your cold, still toughing it out. You did an amazing job, and I appreciate it. I know I learned a lot personally, and I hope everybody else enjoyed it. And from the chat, I know that a lot of people took a lot from this. And I just want to reiterate, the Health Equity Speaker Series is a monthly event, and you can find all of our upcoming programming for GLOMED on our community programming page, which is on our website, which will be linked in the chat. Thank you, India. And again, if you would like to invest in our ability to continue offering programming such as like this, we'll drop our donation link as well in the chat. Until next time, have a great rest of your day, and bye, everyone.
Thank you so much, everyone, for the opportunity. It was my pleasure.
Thank you.